General Isaiah Trent wasn't in uniform when he pulled over to check his Jeep, but to Officer Wilburn, that didn't matter. She saw a black man alone on a rural Georgia road and decided he was a threat. No questions, no protocol, just handcuffs and humiliation. She ignored his ID, ignored his calm voice, and ignored the truth. He was a 3-star general. Racism doesn't ask for rank. It assumes guilt based on skin. What she didn't know. One call would bring the Pentagon to her doorstep. Subscribe if you believe dignity should never be mistaken for danger. Officer Tracy Wilburn didn't see a decorated hero when she stepped out of her cruiser. She saw a problem. A tall black man pulled over on the side of a quiet Georgia highway, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes calm but alert. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wonder why his license plate had a military insignia, or why the phone in his hand looked like government issue. She didn't see the quiet strength in his posture, or the fatigue of someone who had seen war. She saw skin. That was enough. "Step out of the vehicle!" she barked, her hand already on her holster. Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent had commanded soldiers in combat zones across 3 continents. He had faced insurgents in Kabul and diplomats in Washington. But here, on a back road in Schlage County, Georgia, in a plain polo shirt with no rank displayed, he was reduced to a suspicious individual with possible intent. His only weapon? His composure. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "My identification is in the car. I am a federal officer." She didn't care. "Hands on the trunk, now." The gravel bit into his shoes as he complied, feeling the tension grow behind him. No backup, no body cam, no questions, just control. The sun beat down through the thick canopy of trees, and in the distance, a pickup slowed. A teenager in the back seat pulled out his phone. Then another car stopped. Eyes began to gather. Phones began to rise. The world was beginning to watch. Wilburn didn't care. She was feeding off her own authority, trying to make a point she didn't even understand. She gripped his wrist, twisted it, forced his hands behind his back, and slammed the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "You're resisting," she said. He wasn't. He didn't. But the lie would stick, unless something stronger surfaced. "I've identified myself," Isaiah said again, eyes locked on hers. "I am Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent, United States Army." She scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" The teenager filming leaned forward. "It says Army on the jacket," he whispered. His father nodded. "Keep recording." From the back of the cruiser, Isaiah sat still, his breathing controlled, his wrists bruised, his dignity intact. This wasn't new. This wasn't a surprise. But it was a line, a sharp one, and it had just been crossed. She still hadn't verified his credentials, still hadn't run his plates, still hadn't considered she might be wrong. And that was about to cost her. Deputy Boyd arrived first. Calm, experienced, older. He listened. He looked. He opened the back door of the cruiser. "Sir?" he asked carefully. "Your name?" "Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent." "Did she see your ID?" She held it in her hand. Boyd shut the door without saying more. He turned to Wilburn. There were no raised voices. No shouting. Just a quiet shift in power as Boyd made his own call, stepping away from the crowd, speaking into his radio with a tone that meant business. Then came the SUVs. Black, federal, undeniable. Colonel James Ellison stepped out in full dress uniform, not for show, but for presence. He walked straight to the cruiser, opened the back door himself, and extended a hand. "Sir," he said, "are you all right?" Isaiah nodded. "Physically." "We'll take it from here." Colonel Ellison turned to Deputy Boyd. "Who's in charge?" "I've been on scene 10 minutes. She made the stop." Ellison nodded, then approached Wilburn. "Did you verify his ID?" "He didn't cooperate. He gave me some fake-looking credential." "That credential," Ellison interrupted, "is a Pentagon-issued Level 4 clearance. You detained a 3-star general without cause." Wilburn's mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came out. "Do not speak another word. This is being escalated to the DOJ and the State Attorney General." And the bystanders were still filming, phones still recording. Truth, raw and undeniable, was already being shared with the world. Isaiah stepped out on his own. No fury in his stride, no shouting, just the jacket. Finally on his shoulders, stars gleaming faintly in the late afternoon sun. Sheriff Nix arrived next. Slow, silent. His face said everything. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. "Sir," Colonel Ellison replied, "your deputy violated protocol, used excessive force, and unlawfully detained a federal officer." Nix looked at Isaiah, then at Wilburn. "Tracy," he said, "give me your badge and gun." "Sheriff, I was doing my job." "Now," he cut her off, "before you embarrass yourself further." She hesitated, but the phones were still pointed at her. She handed them over, quietly. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence was louder. The next morning, the videos were everywhere. General profiled in Georgia. Unlawful arrest caught on camera. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag General Trent, dignity, detained. This is America. The Reardon family, the ones who filmed it, were flooded with interview requests. But they declined. Instead, 17-year-old Miles posted the clip on YouTube. No edits, no commentary. Just raw footage with the title, "I didn't know who he was, but I knew what was wrong." 500,000 views in 2 days. Isaiah didn't speak to the press. No interviews, no statements, just a private call to his wife and a long drive back to Fort Benning. But 3 days later, at a small veterans forum, he stood in front of a crowd in a church basement. No medals, no podium, just truth. "I've never felt smaller than I did that day," he said. "But I won't carry that anger. I'll use it. Because when you're silent in the face of injustice, you become part of it." Wilburn was fired 5 days later. Not because of one mistake, but because people finally saw what had always been there. Complaints resurfaced. Stories emerged. Patterns came to light. And change followed. Schley County launched a new training program: bias, perception, and accountability. Not as punishment, but correction. Community forums opened. Conversations started. None of it erased what happened, but it made sure it wouldn't happen again. At least not without consequence. Isaiah Trent didn't want revenge. He wanted change, and he got it. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe. Let the truth be louder than the silence. Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent had endured war zones, sat through tense peace negotiations, and buried more soldiers than he could name. But nothing prepared him for the cold humiliation of being profiled, handcuffed, and caged like a criminal in his own country. On a back road in Georgia, 4 miles from Ellaville, where pine trees towered over cracked asphalt and old men sat in diners sipping sweet tea, pretending not to notice how little had changed. It was supposed to be a short detour, The GPS on his military-grade phone had gone haywire after a system update, and he needed 2 minutes, just 2, to reset his route. He pulled off near a gravel turnout, still wearing civilian clothes, slacks, loafers, and a gray polo. His jacket, stitched with 3 stars and his name, lay neatly folded in the back seat. But that didn't matter. It never does. The crunch of gravel behind him drew his attention to a sheriff's cruiser with no siren, just flashing lights and a woman stepping out with the kind of authority that feeds on unchecked power. Her name tag read Wilburn. Her voice carried no curiosity, only command. "What are you doing out here?" No greeting, no protocol, not even a fake smile, just suspicion. Isaiah answered calmly, "Adjusting my GPS." She didn't listen. She looked into his car like she expected to find a weapon. "You're on private land. This is a dumping zone. Step out of the vehicle." "Ma'am," he said, trying to de-escalate. "I'm a federal officer. My ID is inside. Let me retrieve it." "Hands on the trunk," she snapped. "Now." Isaiah hesitated, feeling the sting of familiarity, the way white authority often operated unchecked in spaces where black bodies were seen as threats. He complied anyway, slowly, deliberately. Even as she yanked his wrist, kicked his legs apart, and forced his hands onto the hot metal of the trunk. There was no backup, no body cam, just her hunger to dominate. "You're resisting," she accused, and the words struck harder than her grip. Because they weren't just wrong, they were rehearsed. Isaiah clenched his jaw, swallowing the surge of anger that burned in his chest, the same fury he'd spent years unlearning. She twisted his arm harder, slammed the cuffs on too tight, and said nothing else. But the silence wasn't empty. It was layered, humiliating, electric, and deeply familiar. From across the road, a teenager inside a pickup truck started filming. His father watched, too stunned to speak. Isaiah didn't move. Couldn't. Every breath felt like defiance, every inch of stillness a protest. But the pain was spreading, from his wrists to his spine to that invisible place where dignity gets chipped away. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. Wilburn didn't blink. Instead, she reached into his back pocket and grabbed his wallet without consent, flipping through the contents like they were meaningless papers. She didn't even see it. The Level 4 Pentagon security clearance card tucked behind his Army credentials. Or maybe she saw it and dismissed it, because in her world, black men in backwoods Georgia didn't have that kind of authority. She radioed in a vague report. "Suspicious male, possibly armed." Possibly armed. 2 words that had signed the death warrant for men like him too many times. Isaiah stood frozen, knowing what came next if he twitched wrong or dared speak out. The cuffs dug into his skin, now raw and burning. The air was heavy with humidity and fear. A second siren sounded in the distance, but it was still minutes away. Wilburn paced in circles, adrenaline pumping, control slipping. Isaiah said quietly, "Please call your supervisor or allow me to identify myself." "You don't make requests," she shot back, rage blooming in her face. "You wait." "I'm not resisting," he said again, feeling his heartbeat thudding like a war drum in his ears. "I'm cooperating. I've given you my name, my title, and my ID. I'm Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent." She rolled her eyes. "You people and your lies." The phrase cracked something inside him, not just because of the words, but because of how easily she spoke them. No fear, no hesitation. Just centuries of weight in 3 syllables. You people. The crowd by the road had grown. A third car pulled over. Still no one stepped in. But they all filmed, and that mattered more than they knew. A whisper passed between the teenager and his dad. "He's got stars on that jacket in the back seat," the boy said. The camera zoomed in. When the second deputy finally arrived, Lamar Boyd, a tall black man with salt in his beard. He didn't draw a weapon. Didn't speak to Wilburn first. He went to the cruiser, opened the back door, and asked, "Sir, your name?" "Lieutenant General Isaiah Trent," he answered. "Did she see your ID?" "She had it in her hand." Boyd shut the door and walked away, making his own call. It wasn't loud, but it was urgent. "Yes, sir, that's what he said. Confirmed. Standing by." Wilburn noticed the shift. Her eyes darted between phones and Boyd. She felt it now, the unraveling, but she doubled down. "You're interfering with a lawful investigation," she snapped, reaching in and dragging Isaiah from the cruiser again. "Turn around." "I've already identified myself," he replied. "You're resisting again," she insisted, twisting his wrist so hard that he winced, the cuffs cutting deeper into the torn skin. "This isn't necessary," he murmured. But she wasn't listening anymore. She was reacting. Fueled by panic, driven by fear that someone might actually hold her accountable. She shoved him forward, toward the cruiser again. His shoulder hit the frame, sending a jolt down his side. Still, he didn't fight back. Then came the black SUVs. No lights, no sirens, just presence. Power that didn't need to shout. Colonel Marcus Ellison stepped out, crisp in full uniform, and approached like a storm with silence at its back. "Sir," he said to Isaiah, "are you all right?" "Physically," Isaiah answered. "What happened here is something else entirely." Ellison turned to Wilburn. "Did you verify his ID?" "He didn't cooperate," she said. "He gave me some fake-looking card." "That card is federal clearance." He looked at her with a disgust that was colder than rage. "You put a 3-star general in cuffs without cause." He didn't say who he was. He did. You just didn't believe him. Her mouth opened, but he cut her off again. "Say nothing more. Everything's on record." Sheriff Nix arrived minutes later, dust clouding behind his truck, a limp in his step, and weariness in his eyes. He looked at Wilburn. "Tracy," he said, "give me your badge." "Sheriff, not a request." She handed it over, defeated. But Isaiah didn't look at her. He couldn't. The pain wasn't just physical anymore. It had sunk into the marrow of his bones, dragging up old wounds from his early years, being followed in stores, pulled over for no reason, watched closely by white officers who didn't care about his education, his rank, or his humanity. He stood by the car, the cuffs finally removed, but the skin on his wrists peeled, raw and bleeding slightly. The crowd stayed quiet, phones still recording, documenting not just an incident, but a truth long denied. Isaiah said nothing more, until the sheriff turned to him. "General, I apologize. I don't have the words." "I appreciate that," Isaiah said. "But this isn't about me. It's about what she thought she could do, because she assumed I wasn't someone who mattered." His voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. It carried years of history, pain, and grace. Colonel Ellison asked quietly, "Would you like to press charges?" Isaiah looked at the crowd, the teenager who filmed, the father who stayed, the witnesses who saw what justice should look like. "Not yet," he said. "Let the public see it. Let them learn from it." Because some lessons shouldn't be buried in courtrooms, they needed to be taught in living rooms, classrooms, and across every badge-wearing institution in the country. By the next day, the video had gone viral. General profiled in Georgia. Unlawful arrest caught on camera. Hashtags lit up. Trent truth, justice, for Isaiah, dignity under fire, the Reardon family, The ones who filmed it were invited to Washington. Miles Reardon uploaded the uncut footage titled, "I didn't know who he was, but I knew what was wrong." It hit 2 million views in 48 hours. Meanwhile, Isaiah returned to Fort Benning in silence. No press conferences, no interviews, just a call to his wife and a quiet evening walk on base, thinking about how often dignity must be defended, not in war, but in everyday moments of disrespect. 3 days later, he gave one speech, unplanned, at a small veterans forum in a church hall. No uniform, no script, just him. "I've faced threats overseas," he began, "but I've never felt more alone than I did on that roadside." He paused. The room was silent. "But I won't carry hatred. That's not what this country needs. What we need is accountability. And more importantly, honesty. We can't fix what we pretend doesn't exist." His words didn't ignite applause. They drew something deeper. Reflection. Wilburn was terminated the following week. Not just for what she did, but for the culture she represented. Schley County launched new reforms, implicit bias training, civilian review panels. A shift. Not enough. But something. As for Isaiah, the scars on his wrists faded, but the impact didn't. Every cadet he trained after that heard one message. Some people will only see your skin, not your stars. Don't let that stop you from standing tall, because sometimes the most powerful protest is how you choose to stand still. Colonel Naomi Mitchell never imagined her years of classified work in cyber intelligence would amount to this, standing in the sweltering heat of a Mississippi roadside, surrounded by deputies who didn't believe her name, her title, or her truth. She wasn't in uniform today. That decision, once made to protect her privacy, now felt like a silent sentence. Her civilian clothes, simple jeans and a navy t-shirt, betrayed nothing of the decades she spent defending this country from digital warfare, domestic terror, and global surveillance threats. But none of that mattered when her face was the only evidence they needed to justify suspicion. One broken tail light, that's what they claimed. That was the excuse. But she knew better. The way the officer's eyes narrowed when she spoke, the smirk when she said, "Colonel," the dismissive laugh when she offered her Department of Defense ID. This wasn't about vehicle violations. This was about control, and worse, erasure. They wanted her small, voiceless, forgettable. But Naomi Mitchell had never been any of those things, and she wasn't going to start now. What hurt most wasn't the way they spoke to her. It was the way they ignored her, like her words didn't deserve response, like the documents in her briefcase weren't real. "Ma'am, step out of the car." The voice wasn't angry. It was bored, routine, as if detaining innocent black women was just part of the script. Naomi's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. Her military-issued device had 2 encrypted chips, one for internal defense communication, one for secure authentication. But when she tried to explain that, the deputy scoffed. "You trying to trick me with some burner phone?" Her throat tightened. "This phone is military grade. You're violating federal protocol by—" He snatched it from her hand and threw it to the hood of the cruiser. It slid, bounced once, and hit the pavement with a crunch that echoed louder than it should have. She felt that sound in her ribs. Not because of the cost of the tech, but because it symbolized something deeper. It was the sound of being silenced. She looked at him, square in the eye. "What you're doing is illegal." "What I'm doing," he said, stepping closer, "is my job." "No. What you're doing is profiling, intimidation, and abuse of power." His hand hovered near his sidearm. "Are you resisting?" Her body stilled. "I'm speaking." But it didn't matter. Within moments, another cruiser pulled up. Then another. None asked her for her side of the story. One of them walked around her car, inspecting it like it was some smuggler's van. "You military, huh?" another deputy called out. "Then you know how to follow orders." She said nothing. She couldn't. Her words were twisted before they even left her mouth. She reached toward her jacket on the front seat, where her official badge and rank insignia were clipped. But a hand yanked her back. "Don't move unless we tell you to." They cuffed her. Roughly. Hands behind her back, palms pressed so tightly the bones in her wrists ached. No Miranda rights. No questions. Just force. She felt the hot metal biting into her skin. The pain was real, but the humiliation, that was worse. It was deep, piercing, the kind of hurt that didn't bruise but settled in the gut like a stone. She'd faced enemies in digital shadows, people who could bring down entire infrastructures with a single keystroke, but none of them had ever made her feel this small. She sat in the back of the cruiser, the leather seat sticking to her arms, the heat unbearable. Her lips were dry. Her phone, now shattered on the roadside, was her lifeline to her commanding office. But even without it, she wasn't powerless. She turned slowly to the window and saw it. A teenager, maybe 15, holding a phone, recording. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. His mother stood beside him, whispering, "Keep it steady, baby." Naomi's eyes locked with his. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to because he saw. He saw her. Not a suspect, not a liar, a woman, a soldier, a target, a truth they were trying to bury. And his phone became the last line of defense, not a weapon, but a shield. A mirror. The deputies hadn't run her plates, hadn't checked her badge number, hadn't contacted the Pentagon line embroidered inside her jacket collar. All they saw was her skin and their own authority. And it was enough for them to believe they could do anything they wanted. She bit the inside of her cheek to stay grounded. Her wrists were bleeding now. She shifted in the seat to relieve the pressure, but the cuffs only cut deeper. She was afraid. Yes, but not for herself. For the message this sent. For how easily this could have gone unnoticed if not for a kid with a phone and a mother with courage. Somewhere inside, her training kicked in. Focus. Breathe. Be still. She counted backward from 100, then from 500, anything to keep the rage from erupting. Because if she screamed, they'd say she was aggressive. If she cried, they'd say she was unstable. If she fought, they'd say she was dangerous. And then, finally, a different sound. Not sirens, not gravel, but polished tires, black SUVs, federal, undeniable. 3 of them. They didn't flash their lights. They didn't need to owe him. The air shifted. The posture of the officers changed. Fear finally landed, but not in Naomi. It landed in the ones who thought she was powerless. Out stepped Commander Dev Patel, someone who'd served beside Naomi in digital counterterrorism for 5 years. He didn't say a word to the deputies at first. He walked straight to her window and opened the door himself. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, "are you all right?" She nodded, barely. Her lips were cracked, her shoulders aching. "Yes, sir." "You're safe now. We've got this." He turned to the officers, who suddenly couldn't find their words. "This woman outranks every one of you," he said, his voice like thunder wrapped in calm. "You detained a senior colonel without cause, without ID check, and with excessive force." "She refused to comply," one deputy stammered. "We had suspicions she—" "You had bias, and you acted on it. That's not suspicion. That's profiling." The teenager's phone was still filming. The crowd had grown, a pastor, a teacher, a retired veteran in a Vietnam hat. The people had shown up. Naomi stood now, free, but unsteady. Her wrists had red rings where the cuffs had been. Her voice trembled, but she found her breath. I showed them who I was. They didn't care. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a reckoning. The next day, the video spread. Millions of views. The headline read, "Senior Army Colonel detained on false grounds, saved by a teen's camera." The teen's name was Marcus. His video was titled, "I Knew She Was Somebody." But even if she wasn't, this wasn't right. Naomi didn't appear on the news. She didn't chase interviews. She spoke only once, at a STEM program she sponsored in D.C. "I work in truth," she said. "And the truth is this. I wasn't believed until a camera told them to believe me. But our dignity shouldn't require proof." Her voice cracked then. She didn't apologize. The officers were suspended. One resigned. An investigation opened. But the real shift, that happened in living rooms, in classrooms, in places where people finally started to ask, how many stories like this go untold? And you, right now, can help make sure this one isn't. If this story moved you, if it made your heart break, or your fists clench, if you saw yourself, your sister, your mother, or your daughter in Colonel Naomi Mitchell, like this video. Share it. Speak on it. Because she stood still while the world watched her crumble. And somehow, she still stood tall. Support her by supporting the truth. Tap like to let her know she wasn't alone. Subscribe to help us tell the stories that would otherwise be silenced. Because in the end, it wasn't her badge that saved her. It was your attention. And that changes everything. They told her it couldn't be done, that it shouldn't be done. But Captain Amina Clark didn't ask for permission. She saw something no one else dared to confront. Something buried beneath redacted files, restricted access folders, and untraceable communications routed through satellite mirrors. And when she made the decision to act, she knew it would cost her everything. Her rank, her clearance, maybe even her life, but silence to her felt more dangerous than exposure. Now, locked inside a windowless federal interrogation room under a flickering fluorescent light, with 2 Homeland Security officials waiting behind mirrored glass, Amina sat in her wrinkled uniform, boots dusty from a mission no one admitted existed, refusing to answer the first question they asked. Who gave you the order? Because the truth was even more dangerous than the secret she uncovered. She had given the order herself. It had started with a name. A single, misspelled name buried in a logistics file that shouldn't have crossed her desk. A supply route meant for routine Border Patrol support. But something was off. The shipments didn't match the destinations. Medical crates labeled standard relief going to bases with no humanitarian operations. And then she saw it. An encrypted manifest with only one destination. Black Site Echo 7. A base that officially didn't exist. A base she'd heard rumors of back in Kandahar, whispered about by analysts who were reassigned or disappeared. But when she tried to access the file, her clearance was flagged. Within 48 hours, her security badge was suspended. Someone had noticed. That's when Amina knew she was right over the target. She could have walked away. Let the file vanish. Let the guilt fade. But something wouldn't let her. Maybe it was her mother's voice. Stand tall even when the wind tries to push you down. Maybe it was that boy she saw in Aleppo, eyes wide with trauma, chained to a cot in a so-called recovery clinic run by U.S. contractors. Or maybe it was just instinct. Whatever it was, it pushed her into action. Off the grid, no backup, no authority. She made a copy of the manifest. Then she vanished. Burner phones, off-book travel, ghosted routes through contractor airfields, and retired surveillance pilots who owed her favors from a dozen battlefields ago. For 7 days, she was invisible. She slept in the back of cargo planes, in safe houses hidden inside bombed-out shells of cities. She wore civilian clothes, dyed her hair, spoke in accents that didn't belong to her. And finally, on the 8th day, she reached it. Echo 7. A concrete slab cut into the side of a mountain, shielded by electromagnetic pulse barriers and a fence laced with facial recognition sensors. Getting in was impossible. But impossible was Amina Clark's specialty. What happened inside that base, she still hasn't told anyone. Not the officials interrogating her now, not the colonel who vouched for her clearance, not even the whistleblower network who begged her to come forward. All anyone knows is this: she walked in alone and walked out with a flash drive laced in her boot, 3 cracked ribs, and a silence that's louder than anything she's ever spoken. The footage, if it's real, shows cages. Not cells, cages, teenagers. Some in uniforms from other countries. Some in clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. No formal documentation, no medical staff. Just private contractors and black site interrogators with no name tags. One of them, according to the metadata, used to work for a domestic counterintelligence agency. Amina doesn't say his name. She just calls him the Butcher. She found him standing over a 17-year-old boy whose wrists were zip-tied to a steel grate. The boy's file said suspected courier. No proof, no charge, just suspected. That was enough. No one knows exactly how Amina got the drive out. No one's sure how she avoided facial capture, how she rerouted the base's backup power long enough to blind the motion sensors. There are only pieces, rumors from retired tech operatives, low-res satellite bursts showing a lone figure in desert fatigues crawling through a ventilation shaft beneath a supply truck. They say she stitched her own ribs with field thread and collapsed from pain inside a military contractor's cargo container somewhere outside New Mexico. She wasn't found. She delivered herself, walked into Fort Meade's front gate, bleeding, dehydrated, flash drive in hand, and dropped it on the desk of someone she thought she could trust. But now that drive is missing. Her clearance revoked, her credibility attacked. She's being held for evaluation, code for containment, and the story's being rewritten in real time. The footage they denied existed has been marked fabricated. The people in the cages are now labeled enemy combatants. And the woman who risked her life to expose it all? They're calling her unstable, reckless, a possible traitor. In the room, the interrogators ask again, "Who helped you?" And again, she says nothing. Not because she's afraid, but because she knows what she did can't be erased just because they won't admit it. What they don't know is that before she walked into that building, she scheduled a backup, a dead man's switch. If she didn't access her phone within 48 hours, a set of files would be sent, anonymously, to 5 international media outlets. The timer is ticking. The truth is coming, whether they like it or not. But here's the question no one can answer. Why would one woman risk her entire future, her safety, her life, to uncover something everyone else refused to see? What gave her the courage to take on the system that made her? Why didn't she run? Why didn't she hide? Why is she still refusing to break? Maybe it's because Amina Clark isn't built like most people. Maybe it's because justice isn't a slogan to her. It's a duty. Maybe it's because she's tired of being told to wait, to obey, to stay quiet, while others suffer in silence. And maybe, just maybe, it's because someone has to be first. Someone has to burn so others can see the smoke. So now it's your turn. If this story shook you, if it left you wondering what she saw inside that base, how she survived, what happens next, drop a comment below. Let Amina know she's not alone, that her risk wasn't for nothing, that there are people out there who still believe in truth, no matter the cost. And if you think more people need to hear this, like, share, subscribe, because this is just the beginning, and someone out there is already trying to erase the end. When Officer Dana Krell ordered the woman out of her car, she didn't ask for a name, only assumed one. She saw a black woman behind the wheel of a new Mercedes-Benz parked near a downtown medical plaza and decided that couldn't be right. The tags weren't expired. There was no traffic violation, but Dana claimed she fit the description of someone reported for trespassing earlier. There was no report, just a call from a coffee shop manager across the street who didn't like the way she was parked. The woman hadn't spoken rudely. She hadn't entered the cafe. She hadn't even left her vehicle. But that didn't matter. In Officer Krell's mind, she wasn't supposed to be there. And so, she approached the car with one hand resting on her holstered weapon, her voice sharp, her tone commanding, not curious. "Ma'am, I need to see your license and step out of the vehicle." The woman, calm, soft-spoken, visibly tired, said, "I'm just waiting for someone." "I didn't ask what you were doing," Krell replied. "Step out now." The woman complied, slowly, carefully. Not because she was guilty, but because she knew how dangerous misperceptions could become. Her name was Dr. Alexis Monroe, but no one called her that in this moment. Not Officer Krell, not the backup unit that arrived within minutes. They called her ma'am like it was a challenge, not a courtesy. "Is this car yours?" they asked. "What are you doing here?" they pressed. "Why aren't you cooperating?" they accused, even as she answered every question. The tone in their voices implied suspicion, not inquiry. When she asked to call her assistant, they refused. When she tried to retrieve her ID badge from her purse, they told her to keep your hands visible. They patted her down against the hood. They searched her bag without a warrant, and when she asked for a supervisor, they laughed. "We are the authority here," Krell said. And then, without reason, she was cuffed. The people passing by didn't know her story. They didn't know that Dr. Alexis Monroe was the newly appointed chief executive officer of the city's largest hospital network, the first black woman to ever hold the position. They didn't know she had completed her double doctorate before 30, or that she had returned to this city, the one that had once labeled her difficult in her medical residency, to rebuild a broken healthcare system from the inside out. No, all they saw was a woman in designer slacks and modest heels being handcuffed outside a parking garage, and the officers didn't stop to ask either. Krell stood with folded arms, sunglasses hiding her eyes, like she'd just won something. "You people always think you can talk your way out," she muttered. Alexis heard that phrase in slow motion. "You people." Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard it before. Too many times. And still, it always cut in a different place. They placed her in the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut behind her like a sentence. Alexis didn't scream. She didn't resist. She just sat there, heart pounding, wrists aching, pride unraveling thread by thread. Her phone buzzed endlessly in her purse, now in Krell's custody. Somewhere inside the hospital building, the board of directors was waiting for her. She was scheduled to give a keynote presentation on equitable care initiatives. There were news cameras inside, a ribbon-cutting ceremony planned, patients gathered. But she was missing. And no one outside that cruiser knew where she was or what was being done to her. That's when it happened. A nurse from the hospital recognized her. She'd been walking toward the medical plaza and saw the cuffs. Her footsteps slowed. Her eyes widened. "That's Dr. Monroe," she whispered. Krell turned. "Excuse me?" The nurse's voice sharpened. "That woman in your car, she's the CEO of this hospital. You just arrested our chief executive." The words were loud enough for others to hear. A tech from radiology stopped in the parking lot, pulled out his phone. A physician's assistant sprinted back into the building. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, and just like that, a quiet detainment became something else. Krell tried to double down. She refused to comply, she said. She was acting suspicious. But the staff didn't buy it. They had seen this woman lead emergency pandemic response, overhaul pediatric care access, cut wait times in half at the urgent care centers. She was the reason half the community even had insurance. And now she was sitting in the back of a police cruiser while her presentation slot passed her by. It took 12 minutes for the hospital's public relations director to arrive. It took 2 more for a local journalist, already on site to cover the event, to start rolling footage. And when the door opened and Alexis stepped out, her wrists red and indented from the cuffs, the flash of cameras was almost blinding. "What happened?" someone asked. She didn't answer. Her voice had momentarily failed her. She just looked at Krell. Not with rage, but with something deeper. Disappointment, disbelief. "I told you who I was," she said finally. "You just didn't believe me." By the time the truth fully broke, it was too late for apologies. The footage of her being handcuffed had already gone viral. The hospital board issued a statement that same night, calling the incident deeply troubling. The mayor's office contacted Alexis privately to offer a public apology, but Alexis didn't accept it. Not yet. She told them she didn't want a statement. She wanted reform. "Don't apologize to me," she said. "Apologize to every black woman who didn't have a title you respect. Because the only reason you're sorry now is because of who I am. But I'm not the only one this happens to." Krell was placed on administrative leave. 2 other officers involved were reassigned pending review. But that didn't undo what was done. That didn't take away the ache Alexis felt when she lay awake that night replaying the phrase, "you people." That didn't erase the sting of being told, once again, that her excellence wasn't visible unless she wore it like armor, that her word meant nothing until it was validated by someone white. The following week, Alexis stood at a podium, this time intentionally, and gave the speech she was meant to deliver. Not the ribbon-cutting ceremony, not the press release draft. A new speech. One she wrote from her heart. "There are days when you wear your title like a shield," she said. "But even then, the world will find ways to pierce it. I was reminded this week that credentials can't protect you from bias, that no amount of success can make you invisible to those who choose not to see you." The room was silent. She let the moment stretch. "But I will not be small to make others comfortable. I will not lower my voice to appease ignorance. I will lead loudly, stand fully, and fight fiercely for those who don't get a news crew when they're cuffed without reason." The applause didn't come instantly. It rose slowly, people standing not because they were told to, but because they couldn't sit anymore. They weren't just clapping for her. They were clapping for what she endured, for what she survived, for how she turned pain into purpose. Today, the footage of Dr. Alexis Monroe being wrongfully detained is used in law enforcement training seminars across the state. Her face, once captured behind a cruiser window, is now etched in the minds of thousands as a symbol of quiet strength and undeniable dignity. She didn't press charges against the officer, but she insisted that Krell complete an intensive program on implicit bias, civil rights history, and direct community service at the hospital. And what about that nurse? The one who spoke up? Alexis hired her personally to run a new diversity and advocacy outreach program. Because speaking up, especially in those moments, takes courage. And courage should never go unnoticed. So now, to you reading this, to the one who's followed this journey, who's felt the heat rise in your chest at each injustice, to the one who sees the reflection of your own battles in Alexis's calm defiance, let her know. Drop a comment to tell Dr. Monroe she wasn't alone. Like this story to lift her voice higher. And subscribe if you believe that truth, when seen, should always be shared. Because some stories aren't just powerful, they're necessary. When Vanessa King boarded the flight from Houston to New York, she wasn't thinking about confrontation. She wasn't dressed for it. No uniform, no badge, no title pinned to her blazer. Just a quiet black woman in a tailored navy suit and low heels, rolling a carry-on with one hand and balancing a work folder in the other. She had a window seat in first class, 2A, a gift to herself after a grueling quarter of running crisis response for the city. She'd led emergency protocol during a deadly fire at a senior care facility just last month, sleeping in her office, organizing trauma teams, comforting grieving families. But no one on this flight knew that. They didn't know that Vanessa was the newly appointed Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Services for the state of New York, the youngest and first black woman ever to hold the role. And unfortunately, the flight attendant didn't ask. She just assumed. Her name was Madison Brooks, blonde, polished, and perfectly cold. When Vanessa stepped into first class and showed her boarding pass, Madison's smile flickered. "This section's reserved for first-class passengers," she said coolly. "I know," Vanessa replied gently. "Seat 2A. Madison's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure?" Vanessa didn't flinch. She repeated calmly, 2A. A few other passengers looked over, curious. Vanessa reached into her purse, pulled out the boarding pass, and offered it. Madison glanced at it, then held it a moment too long, like she was hoping it would change. Finally, she stepped aside, her smile strained. Vanessa walked past her, ignoring the heat rising in her chest. But it didn't end there. As she settled into her seat, the tension followed. Madison checked on every other first-class passenger, offering champagne, placing hot towels delicately on trays, but skipped Vanessa twice. When Vanessa finally asked for water, Madison gave it to her in a plastic cup, not a glass like the others. No lemon slice, no napkin. And then came the indignity. Just before takeoff, a man in business attire approached the cabin, clearly agitated. "I was told I could have 2A. My upgrade cleared." Madison walked over, looked at Vanessa, then looked back at the man. "Let me double-check," she said. She didn't double-check anything. She simply leaned toward Vanessa and whispered, "There's been a mix-up. Would you mind moving back to 9C? I can offer you a free drink." Vanessa blinked slowly, her voice tight. "My ticket is for this seat." Madison smiled without warmth. "The gentleman had an upgrade confirmation. There's no need to make a scene." It was the word "scene" that did it. The way it dripped from Madison's mouth like a threat disguised as concern. Vanessa looked at the man, who shrugged and smirked. She looked around the cabin, watching as no one stood up for her. Then slowly, she reached into her purse again, this time not for her ticket, but for her government ID, the one marked with a gold state seal and her full title. She held it up, deliberately. "This is not an upgrade. It's a purchased seat, and I will not be moving." Madison's face shifted then, an involuntary twitch, as though she'd just realized she had made a grave mistake. But it was too late. The passengers had seen. The moment had been made. And Vanessa, despite the knot in her throat and the embarrassment crawling over her skin, sat still, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap, refusing to shrink. Because she knew this wasn't about a seat. It was about how easily a black woman's presence in a space of privilege is questioned, undermined, erased. The flight continued, but the energy had changed. A young woman in 2C leaned toward Vanessa and said, "That was incredibly graceful. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Vanessa offered a tired smile, but said nothing. She didn't want grace. She wanted respect. And it shouldn't have taken a badge to earn it. When the plane landed at JFK, she gathered her belongings in silence. She didn't speak to Madison again. But someone else did. A man in a gray suit who had been in 1D, quiet the whole flight, waited until Vanessa disembarked, then walked up to Madison. His voice was calm but cutting. "Do you know who that woman is?" Madison blinked. "She said she was someone with the state?" He smiled, but not kindly. "She's the Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Services. She oversees the protection of 20 million people, including you." Madison said nothing. The man continued. "If you're lucky, she won't say anything. But if she does, this airline will hear about it. Loudly." And she did say something. Not in an interview, not in a viral post, but in a staff leadership conference the next week, during a keynote about invisible stressors in leadership. She told the story from beginning to end. Not with bitterness, not to shame, but to illustrate how even the most accomplished among us are still navigating rooms where their worth is challenged at the door. You don't know someone's story just because you don't recognize their face, she said. You don't know the weight they carry, or the rooms they've had to break into. I shouldn't have to show my ID for you to see my humanity. The room went still. Later that night, the story leaked, not from Vanessa, but from one of the attendees who had recorded the talk on their phone. The clip went viral in less than 48 hours. Deputy Commissioner humiliated on flight. The airline issued a public apology. Madison Brooks was placed under review. But more importantly, people talked, really talked, about unconscious bias, about dignity, about how excellence doesn't shield black women from suspicion. It makes them targets. And Vanessa? She kept going. Because that's what she'd always done. Quiet storms. Silent resilience. She didn't wear her titles like armor. She wore them like reminders of what she survived to earn them, of what her grandmother told her when she was a little girl being followed through department stores. They'll always doubt what you've built, so build it louder. So now, as you sit here and read this, as you picture Vanessa seated in 2A, steady and silent, while the world around her tried to shrink her, tell her you see her. Comment to let her know her story matters. Like this to lift her voice above the static. Because we shouldn't have to be somebody to be treated like somebody. But when we are, and they still doubt us, that's when the truth becomes undeniable. When Elijah Rivers walked into his 6th grade music class that final Monday before winter break, no one expected anything different. He was still the quiet kid who sat near the back, kept his hoodie up a little longer than allowed, and rarely raised his hand. Miss Thornton still barely looked at him when she passed out worksheets or assigned instruments. She still called on the same 3 students when it came time to volunteer. And no one really noticed that Elijah's desk was closest to the door, like a reminder that he was barely inside. That had been the way all semester. His classmates had come to accept it. Elijah, too, had come to expect it. Until that day. They were preparing for the winter showcase, an evening recital where parents, staff, and the local community would fill the school auditorium. Miss Thornton had already picked who would perform, mostly her favorites. The loud students, the polished ones, the ones who looked like they belonged in glossy yearbooks and morning announcements. Elijah's name wasn't on any list. She hadn't asked him if he played anything. She hadn't cared. But what no one knew, not Miss Thornton, not his classmates, not even the principal, was that Elijah had been playing piano since he was 5. Not just playing, composing, practicing, studying. His late grandmother had taught him on a second-hand upright with chipped keys and mismatched pedals. "Play like you've got something to say," she used to tell him. "Even if no one's listening yet." Elijah had been listening. Every day. And this time, he wasn't going to wait to be called on. The moment happened right after rehearsal ended. Students were packing up. Miss Thornton was fussing with the stage lights. The room buzzed with chatter. Elijah saw it then. An open seat at the baby grand piano in the corner. Unguarded. Unnoticed. He stood slowly. Walked over quietly. Sat down. And played. It wasn't a song anyone recognized. It wasn't Mozart or a holiday tune. It was his. An original piece. Delicate at first, soft and searching, then building, rising, crashing with unexpected depth. Chords layered like memory. Notes that didn't just echo. They spoke. The room fell silent. At first, Miss Thornton thought it was a recording. She turned, confused, searching for the source. When she saw Elijah, head bowed, fingers moving like they'd lived on those keys forever, her jaw actually dropped. And for once, she didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish. When he finally lifted his hands, the silence lingered like a held breath. Then one student clapped, then another, and another, until the room filled with it. Not the kind of applause you give for politeness, but the kind that says, "We just saw something special." Miss Thornton stepped forward slowly, her voice softer than anyone had heard it all semester. "Elijah, where did you learn to play like that?" He looked up, blinking, and simply said, "At home." That was the moment everything changed. Elijah was immediately added to the showcase. Not just added, featured. His name printed on the program. A solo spot at the end. The principal, Mr. Garland, came to watch rehearsal the next day. So did the vice principal. Teachers from other departments peeked in through the windows. They hadn't heard Elijah speak much. Now they couldn't believe what they were hearing through his music. The night of the performance, the auditorium was packed. Parents with cameras, younger siblings in wiggly rows, teachers dressed up. And Elijah, quiet as ever, stood backstage in a simple black button-down shirt and slacks, holding his sheet music even though he didn't need it. Miss Thornton placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't ask sooner," she said, eyes glistening. He nodded. "You see me now." When he stepped onto the stage, he didn't look nervous. He looked ready. And when he played, the auditorium disappeared. There were no grades, no seating charts, no assumptions. Just the sound of someone who had waited too long to be heard, finally speaking in the language he knew best. When he stood for his bow, the audience rose with him. Later that evening, a woman approached him in the hallway. She was older, kind-eyed, with a soft scarf and a proud smile. "Your music," she said gently, "made me feel like I knew your heart. Don't ever stop playing, baby." He smiled shyly. "I won't." The next week, Elijah was offered a scholarship to a local youth conservatory. Letters poured in from community members. One was from a retired music teacher offering free mentoring. Another from a local church inviting him to perform at their next service. One letter came from a local city councilwoman. I want to help make sure no student with talent like yours ever gets overlooked again. Miss Thornton changed after that. She started asking every student if they played, if they painted, if they wrote. She started seeing beyond what was easy. Because Elijah taught her that brilliance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it wears a hoodie and avoids eye contact. Sometimes it waits patiently in the back row until someone finally gives it room to shine. And Elijah? He didn't ask for attention. He didn't perform to prove anything. He just played because he had something to say. So if you're listening to this now, if you've ever felt underestimated, passed over, ignored, let Elijah's story remind you of something. You are not invisible. Your gifts matter. And the world needs to hear your song. You may not be handed a microphone. You may not be called on. But when the moment comes, take your seat. Play anyway. Speak anyway. Shine anyway. And if someone sees your light only after you've lit the whole room, let them learn from it. Because people like Elijah don't wait for permission to be great. They just are. If this story touched your heart, tap like to support Elijah and kids like him all over the world who are waiting to be seen. Leave a comment to tell Elijah he did the right thing by standing up for himself, by playing when no one expected him to. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this again. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths, and those are the stories we're here to tell.